Hi guys, today I'm going to be showing you how to make this cute little tote for your American Girl doll. And this one that I made took about 500 single bands, and you can make it bigger or smaller, and the strap you can make it shorter and smaller if you want. It'll take less bands, it's up to you. And I also made this backpack for the American Girl. It's the same pattern, you just have to make it longer, and we're adding a lid in this tutorial. And I'll show you how to add the strap and this little tie to cinch up or to close up our backpack. And once again, you're going to need a lot of bands to make it bigger. This probably took about 1,000 bands. So let's get started. And we're going to make everything using the hook. First, we're going to take a single band. I'm going to be using pink and orange, looping it 4 times on the hook, taking 2 single bands at a time, and we'll always be adding using 2 single bands. We're going to make a single chain, and we're going to make a total of 10 loops to start with. So that's loop 1, 2 single bands, pull it through, 2, 3, So I have 10 single chain on my hook, 2 bands at a time. I'm going to count up 7, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We're going to put a hook through the 7th loop from the top to the bottom, getting 4 loops on a hook. And the pattern is we're going to add 2 single bands and pull it through those 4 loops and getting the loops from the 2 single bands onto a hook, leaving us with 8 loops on a hook. Taking 2 more single bands and pulling all the 8 loops onto the 2 single bands, and the last 2 single bands will pull the 4 loops onto the 2 single bands and getting them onto the hook. So that was the pattern. And we'll always be adding 6 bands on each set. So we'll go to our next loop, loop number 6, put a hook from the top to the bottom, starting our pattern again with 2 single bands, pulling it through the loops and getting it onto a hook, adding 2 more bands for this set, getting all the 8 loops onto our hook, and our last 2 set of bands, pulling it through and getting onto our hook. That finishes our second set, and for loop number 6 we'll continue 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1 the same way. If you're confused, I would recommend you watching the video first before trying it. So once again, we're not going back into the same loop, we're always going to the loop next to it. So I'm going into loop number 5, putting my hook through and repeating my pattern. Grabbing 2 single bands first, getting the 8 loops onto the hook, taking 2 more single bands, pulling the 8 loops onto our hook, and our last 2 for this set, getting them onto our hook. And I'm going to continue till I get to the first loop. where the slipknot band is. I'm onto my first loop where my slipknot band is, putting the hook through that loop, getting the 4 on the chain off onto my hook, and grabbing my 2 single bands, getting the 8 loops onto my hook, and then grabbing my 2 single bands, getting the 8 loops onto my hook, creating 4 loops, and my last 2 single bands for this set onto my hook. So that's what it should look like, and this is the bottom of our tote, and we're going to go back around on this side now of our tote. So what we're going to do, we're going to put a hook into the same loop where the slipknot band is. So put your hook through that same loop where we just put our last set, where the slipknot band is, and let's start the pattern again with our 2 single bands, getting them onto our hook, leaving 8 loops, grabbing 2 more sets of single bands, pulling the 8 loops onto it, and getting them onto our hook, and our last 2 set of bands, pulling them onto our hook. And now we're going to go to the second loop along the bottom of our tote. We're not going to be putting it in the same loop as we did last time where the slipknot band is. We're going to loop number 2. So find that loop, put your hook through, and you should have 4 bands on your hook, and then repeating the same pattern. Grabbing your 2 loops, getting the 4 onto your hook, the 8 onto your hook, adding 2 more single bands, moving all the 8 loops onto your hook, and adding your last 2 bands onto your hook. All you have left is now 4 loops on your hook, and that set is done. So I'm going to continue up to loops 3, 4, 5, and 6, repeating that same pattern. Don't go in the same loop. We're just going to go to the next one. So loop number 3, and just continue that same pattern. So I've just finished my 6th set from where the slipknot band is, so that's loop 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And for the 7th one, we're doing it slightly different. We're repeating some of the patterns, so we're putting a hook through the 7th loop, getting the 4 loop off the chain onto our hook, grabbing 2 single bands, and pulling those loops onto our hook. Now we have 8 loops. Grabbing our next 2 set of bands and getting the 8 loops onto a hook, and we'll stop there. And now we're going to count from the chain on our tote where it's connected to the 7th loop, so 1, 2, and we're going to put our hook through the 2nd loop to connect the bottom of our purse. So we grabbed 4 loops off of the chain from the bottom of our purse to connect it. So once again, here's where the 7th loop is. We're counting here 1, 2, the 2nd loop, put a hook through, and grabbing the 4 loops off of the chain and onto our hook. Taking our 2 single bands, and we'll pull the 8 loops onto our 2 single bands. So that's the bottom of your tote so far. And let's go to the next row. And every time you go to the next row and you complete one row of your tote, you're going to finish it the way I did the last one, where we took 2 bands, putting it in first on our last loop, and then getting the 8 loops onto the 2 single bands, and then closing up that row like we did with this last 2 bands. So now to go to the next row, I'm switching colors. I'm going to go to orange. So I'm taking 2 single bands and we'll make 2 single chains. So that's 1, 2, with 2 single bands at a time. So I'm starting my 2nd row. I'm going to put my hook through this loop along the rim of my tote. So I'm not putting it here, I'm putting it on this one, getting the 4 loops onto my hook. And once again, let's repeat that same pattern, taking 2 single bands, pulling it through the loops on the chain off of the rim, getting the 4 loops, or getting the 8 loops onto our hook, and then pulling the 8 loops onto our 2 single bands, and our last set of 2 single bands for this set, getting them on our hook like that. And I'm going to continue every other loop along the rim of my tote so it's not too big. So here's my next loop along the rim. I'm going to skip that one. I'm going to go to the one next to it. Once again, getting the 4 loops onto my hook and repeating my pattern. And I'm going to go along the rim of my tote here until I get to this other side. Remember to do every other loop so that way your tote doesn't get wider up top. So I'm going to skip that one, grab the next loop onto my hook, and repeating my pattern. So I'm going to go around the rim of my tote till I get to this other side. So here I am on my 2nd row, my orange color, and I'm back to where we started up to form the 2nd row. So I'm going to put my hook through my last loop for this row. Going to skip one, put my hook through this loop, adding my 2 single bands, getting the 8 loops onto my hook. And remember, every time you are ready to finish a row, you just use only 4 bands for your set. So that was my first, this is my 2nd, pulling the 8 loops onto the 2 single bands, and then we'll attach it to close up that row. So from where we did our second chain to start the second row, we're going to count 1, 2 on our orange and put our hook through that chain and grabbing the 4 loops onto our hook, creating now 8 loops on our hook, and pulling the 2 single bands and getting the 8 loops onto the 2 single bands and getting them onto our hook like that. So my second row is done for my orange, and let's do the next row. I'm going to use pink once again to start the next row. We're taking 2 sets of 2 single bands, creating 2 chains. So that's 1, 2, and this will start my third row, and we're going to go along the rim of our tote, skipping every other loop. So I'm going to skip that loop, putting my hook through the second loop, and then repeating the same pattern. So this is what your tote should look like so far, and you can make your tote as long or as big as you want. I'm going to continue up a few more rows, and then I'll show you how to put the handles on your tote. So once again, if I'm doing this loop for this set, for my next set I'm going to skip that loop and start with that one and just go around the rim of your purse or tote to this other side. Remember the last one, you want to only do the 4 single bands and then attaching it and starting up your next row. So I'll come back when I have a few more rows and I'll show you how to do the handle. So as a refresher, I'm almost done with this row, so I'm going to go in once again, skip a loop, go to the next one, grabbing my 2 single bands for my last loop before we go up the next row, getting the 4 loops or the 8 loops on my hook, grabbing 2 more single bands and getting the 8 loops onto the 2 single bands, and then we'll count the chain where we started this row. So 1, 2, putting a hook through the 8 loops, grabbing our last 2 bands for this set and closing up this row and getting the loops onto our hook. And at any point you can switch colors and do any pattern you want. So I'm once again going to do a row or 2 and come back to do the strap. So this is what I have so far for my tote, and I'm on my last hole. I'm about to close this row up, and along the way, if you messed up, just pull the bands that you don't want and then start over. So here's my loops before my last hole. I'm skipping a loop, putting my hook through the next loop on the rim of my tote, grabbing 2 single bands, getting the loops onto my hook, getting my 2 bands, and getting the 8 loops on the 2 single bands, and getting everything on a hook. And we'll stop here because we're about to close up this row. So to close up the row, once again, we're just going to count up 1, 2 on the chain that we created to start the row. Put a hook through, grabbing the 4 loops onto a hook. Now we have 8 loops on our hook. And from here, I'm going to start the strap, and I'll show you how to start it, and you can make it for as long as you want. And then come back, I'll show you how to close it up and add a lid also. So to put the strap with a hook in that position, we're going to take 4 single bands, and you can use as many as you want. Getting it on your hook and pulling all those loops off of your hook and onto the 4 single bands, like that. And you're just going to continue with 4 single bands, or however many bands you want to use, making a single chain to your desired length. So I'm going to continue my single chain with 4 single bands for a little bit until I get my desired length, and I'll come back to show you how to tie it off on the other side. I'm going to be only making my strap this long just to show you how to end it. So we're going to press the top of our tote together so it's lined up, and we'll reach on the other side where we want to connect the strap and just put a hook through the top loops like that, anywhere, just as long as it's squared and lined up on the top of your tote. Grabbing my 4 single bands and pulling the loops through the rim of my tote like that, and then getting all the other loops off of the hook and onto the 4 single bands. And we're going to tie it off kind of like a slip knot, pulling one side of the 4 loops and pulling the other side through it to cinch it off. And if you want to add a little bit of decoration on the side, you can with a little button or something to help this not slip off of your tote. You can also just take the 2 loops on each hand and just tying another knot so that way it doesn't come off, to secure our strap. So this is my tote, and if you don't want a lid on it, you're done. It's slightly bigger than my other one. That's okay, you can make your tote whatever size you want. And we're going to put a hook in the loop that's closest to the strap. So on this side of my tote, I'm going to put my hook through this first loop near my strap. I'm going to take 2 single bands and loop up and onto my hook, grabbing 2 more single bands and pulling through and getting the loops onto my hook. So that's 2 chain onto my hook. Now I'm going to go to the loop right next to it, putting my hook through that loop and getting the 4 bands onto my hook, and repeating my pattern, grabbing my 2 bands, pulling the loops through the rim of my tote, getting the 8 loops on my hook, getting 2 more single bands, and pulling the 8 loops onto my hook, and getting the 4 loops from the 2 single bands onto my hook like that, and then getting my last 2 single bands for this set and onto my hook like that. Now we're going to skip every other loop, so I'm going to skip that one, putting my hook through this loop, getting the 4 bands onto my hook, and repeating that same pattern. So I'm going to continue that same pattern all the way across, skipping every other loop till I get to this side of my tote where the other strap is. And I'll come back when I'm done. So I'm to the other side of my strap. I'm going to do my last set with you, skipping a loop, putting my hook through the next one, and getting the 4 loops off of the rim and getting them onto my hook, grabbing my 2 single bands and getting the 4 loops off of the rim onto my hook. I have 8 loops on my hook, and pulling 2 more single bands and getting the 8 loops onto the 2 single bands and getting those loops onto my hook. Now we're going to make our lid a little bit longer, and you can make it whatever color you want or however long you want. We're taking a hook off of those loops, turning our tote around and re-grabbing our loops and getting them onto a hook so we can repeat the pattern going backwards on the other side. So now at this point, we're going to extend. So at this point, we're going to add 2 single chain to make our lid longer to start the next row for our lid. So taking 2 single bands, creating a single chain, another 2 single bands, going up. So that's what it should look like. So this time we're going to grab every other loop. We're going to skip that loop and put a hook through this center one. So put a hook through, and once again repeating the same pattern, grabbing 2 single bands, getting them onto our hook. We have 8 loops. 2 more single bands, getting the 8 loops onto our single bands, or 2 single bands, and finishing off the pattern with 2 single bands, pulling those loops onto our hook, and just continue all the way to this end here of our lid. I'll come back when I'm done. So I'm almost done with my second row of my lid, and I'm going to stop here. I'm not going to make it any longer. If you do decide to make it longer, you can. Just at the end, just turn your tote around, take your hook out and put it back in, and start back going the other way. So to finish off my last loop, skipping this one, putting my hook through that loop, grabbing my 2 single bands, pulling the loops onto my hook. I have 8 loops, getting 2 more single bands and pulling the 8 loops onto my hook. So with a hook, we're going to count up below, so 1, 2, the second chain from where we loop up to create the first row, putting a hook through the second chain, getting the 4 loops onto our hook. We have 8 loops on our hook, grabbing 2 last single bands, and we're going to pull all 8 loops onto our hook, and then we're going to tie it off on the slip knot. So just pulling the 2 loops over each other and tying it off, and you can just tuck in that slip knot band or those slip knot bands. So that's my strap. It's really short because I just wanted to do a demo for you, and you should make your lid a little longer so it folds up, and you can add a little button on this side if you want, and then just close up your lid together like that. So that's your tote with the lid. So this is the tote. I just took the strap off of the tote so I can make it into a backpack to show you what it can look like as a backpack. And to make the back strap for our backpack, I just took 2 single bands at a time and made a single chain 41 loops long. So to add it to our backpack, I'm going to go to the back of my backpack to the right corner, putting my hook through the bottom loops in the bottom corner like that, getting the cap band end on the single chain that you created, pulling those loops through and getting it onto the other side. And now we're just going to open up the loop of the cap band and then pulling the chain or the strap through so it's attached to one corner of our backpack. And now just go to the center of your backpack, fish your strap through to create one side of the strap for your backpack, and this will be a lot easier so you can adjust it for your American Girl doll. Now for the other side, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go to that corner, put our hook through the loops on the other corner of our backpack, the bottom. Undo your slipknot band, grabbing the 2 loops, getting it onto a hook, pulling the loops through, and tie a slip knot. And to make sure it doesn't come off of our backpack, we're just going to tie it around the strap. Just tie a knot, and you can tie it as many times as you want so that way it doesn't come off, and tuck it in so that way it's not sticking out. So there's the strap for your backpack for your doll. For the front of my backpack, I made a single chain, 14 loops long, with some pom-poms on the end to close up the lid to the front of my backpack. I'm simply taking one end of the pom-pom, looping it through the center of my backpack, pulling it through so it's centered like that, and then when you're ready to close your backpack, just find the center of the lid and just tie it off like that. So to make the tie for the front of your backpack, I'll do a quick one, not as long as I'd want it to, and you can make it whatever length you want. You're going to take 3 single bands, whatever color you want, and loop it once on your backpack. I'm using pink, yellow, and orange. Taking 3 more single rubber bands, the same colors or whatever color you want, looping it once on your hook like that, and you can make your pom-poms as big or as little as you want. Taking a single band for your chain, twist, double, and pulling all those pom-poms onto the single we doubled and onto your hook. And now taking your single band and pulling the loops onto the single band and creating our chain. And you can do that 14 loops long or however long you want. Just keep going. I'll just do a few and then I'll show you how to add the other pom-pom. So once you get to your desired length, you're going to take your pom-pom colors. Mine will be the same, pink, orange, and yellow, and looping it once on my hook. Taking another set, same 3 bands, and looping it once onto your hook. Taking your last single band, we're going to twist, double it on our finger, pulling all your pom-poms onto the single band that we doubled, and then getting the loops off of your chain onto the single we doubled next to the pom-pom. And then we'll tie a slip knot by getting all the loops, the single we doubled, onto our hook and pulling it through to tie our slip knot. So we're going to pull the loops for the slip knot band that's on our hook and open the loop up and push our pom-poms through so it doesn't unravel, and kind of cinch it towards our chain. So there's the front tie for your backpack if you want to tie off the lid to your backpack. So there's your backpack and your tote. I hope you like it. Thanks for watching.